Welcome to Octorum, the literature review for the obscure scientist. My name is Isabelle Berthelot, your host, with Oliver Hutchens, my co-host. Stay tuned for more. Welcome to the first episode. I'm Octorum founder and co-host Isabelle, and I'm here with my co-host Oliver. Oliver, say hi.
Hello, everyone. Isabelle, thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. And we have an amazing idea to explore our project of building this intellectual playground through a podcast, where we hope to dive into essential questions and topics about life, the science of life, the experience of life, through academic literature. But before any assumptions are made on how interesting or engaging this podcast will be, considering that I just said we will be exploring academic literature, I want to reframe what that means in our minds. Often, for both academics and especially for individuals who feel like they weren't very interested in school, academic literature comes off as a very bland, technical type of writing that just seems boring. But this is not a class, this is not a lecture, and we have no expectations of you as a listener. We invite you to join us for this conversation as you are right now. We are, yes, academics, but for us, this just happens to be where our personal passions have led us. I'm a scientist, Oliver's a botanist, and we have this interest in being highly curious about the world around us, the people, the plants, the microorganisms that constitute life, as well as the experiences, spiritual, emotional. Over time, in our jobs and in our research, we've come across these articles written by researchers and scientists just like us, who have fallen in love with a particular topic and have dedicated their life to pushing the boundaries of what we know. And we just want to share and talk about all of these interesting, mind-blowing things that we just never discuss. And with that being said, Oliver, I would love it if you invited our listeners into our lives, shared who we are and what we do.
I would love to invite. So I currently am a micropropagation and seed bank technician. I work in the plant conservation research space right now, and I studied plant ecology at undergrad.
I currently work as a medical research specialist, so I do research about the human body that we can then put towards clinical understandings, new medications, and I earned my degree from undergrad in biology and environmental arts and humanities, and I also have a master's degree in pathology. So, as I mentioned before, we, just like many of you, have questions about reality and existence on a large and small scale. As scientists, we are professional investigators. But before we start diving into strange, dynamic perspectives on science, let's take a minute to consider how we can even evaluate truth. Keep in mind that this episode is philosophy and humanities based more than what our other episodes will be, but we like to keep it creative. For our first topic, we wanted to go back to the beginning of what it means to observe and believe anything to be true. What is the link between learning and science? Because however silly it may seem, it's not as obvious as you think.
We wouldn't be having this podcast episode if the question of what is learning, what is science as a whole, was a straightforward, easy one. This will be answered pretty well along the way as we get more into different papers with different perspectives, looking at science as a cultural entity, historical entity, a conversation happening through time. But for me, I think I've just boiled it down to treating any piece of information you have as just a chunk on its own, and clearly, investigatively, precisely, comparing it to all these other bits of information that you have to try and synthesize it into something you can actually make sense of.
Yeah. And so I feel like science in that way, it's almost like structured learning. Science generally is observation-based. In science, we make observations, and then based on those observations, we try to explain them. And it's that explanation that we call a theory. So during this podcast, every episode, we're going to be referencing literature, like we talked about academic literature, science literature, and all of those pieces are providing, usually, unless it's a review paper, they're providing theories, potential explanation to what we're seeing. But one thing that I just wanted to comment on, in this episode and in this podcast, we're talking so much about truth. But I also want to acknowledge that no scientific journal or scientist claims to have the truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's really claiming to have a theory and claiming to have an explanation. And so I think that even then, it's really interesting that truth by nature is something that's so secure and real, but no scientist would claim that they have the truth. But that's the
Mm-hmm.
best that we can do. And so I think as we're going through this episode, we're talking about like how can we get close to an accurate understanding of the world with science, but truth is so much bigger.
Yeah, the scientific community as a whole that a lot of people don't seem to realize of there's a sense that's very just kind of like cold, inhuman, almost has nothing to do with us, all in the pursuit of truth at its core, isolated to the point where like nothing can question it. All right, obviously, we'll never get there, but we're trying to move in that direction. But I think more and more, even the scientific community is like, we don't even know where that direction is anymore. Like, we at least had the aspiration or this mental model of what truth was. And I feel like even that's starting to fall apart more and more.
Yeah, and I feel like you and I are almost like perfect representations of those people because we're trying to perfect what we're doing in our jobs and like in our careers, the science of it, but at the same time, we also know that that's not enough. Like, there's a deeper truth, there's a more real truth that's bigger than it, bigger than what we do at work. And I think that this is a good example of trying to find it. I don't know if I said that correctly, but anyway, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So, talking about the literature, talking about the theories that it could potentially provide, I currently work in the intersection of microbiology, immunology, pathology, but I'm also trained in the medical humanities, and we both go deeper into our personal lives and our histories in the intro episode. But I've always been interested in how we as creatures have been able to determine whether our neighbors and ourselves are ill or healthy. Because we were once primates, and then we formed this higher level of consciousness, this more detailed communication, and at some point it occurred to us that the other person is acting out of the ordinary, and maybe this change was caused by something other than itself. And I think part of the reason why I find it so interesting is this biological learning. It's really the first example of true learning of something that is not explained by the senses. Illness causes harm to someone, but it's not the same thing as if a hunter stabbed someone and then they died. This process really requires sitting down and brainstorming and getting creative about all of the possible things that might have happened, because you can't see illness attack someone. Even learning about natural phenomenon like weather doesn't even come close to learning and understanding illness, because it can still be pretty much managed by understanding patterns. The sky is cloudy and dark. Rain usually precedes this, so it's likely that if the sky is cloudy and dark, then it will rain. With illness, this universal search for pinpointing what actually happened, it's so fascinating to me. And the wildest part is that it never ends. We're still trying to figure illness out, and we're still trying to even figure out what illness is. Sometimes it's caused by bacteria or pathogens, and then sometimes it's not. And it's interesting to consider what cultures have historically considered to be illness, and what is the line of abnormality. So, with that, I would like to introduce an article that I've read probably 50 times over the past 4 or 5 years. Bear in mind that articles are the most refined communication of one researcher's life work. This is The Origins of Evolution and Culture, written in 1989 by Penn Handwerker, published in the American Anthropologist. For those of you listening, citations will always be found in the show notes. Here, Handwerker discusses the first instances of awareness and the progression of learning. He tracks the development of instinct to consciousness to culture by connecting each development to the survival skill that it gives us to survive in our environment. He begins at awareness and illustrates how awareness, and therefore our experience of life, is regulated by our DNA through genes that regulate senses. Here's the quote. Genes construct mechanisms that permit living things to keep track of changes in the world in which they live. We know these mechanisms as senses. Environments make themselves known to organisms, and organisms track changes in those environments through sound, odor, taste, form, light spectrum absorption, and other forms of sensation." End quote. Later, how each species' genetically encoded senses provides a different level of awareness in the environment, he writes, "For example, we do not have the genetic capability, as do some birds, fish, and at least one mollusk, to sense the Earth's magnetic field. Our genes do not allow us to see ultraviolet light." End quote. So we inherit different capabilities and receive information of our environment that's relevant to our existence through our senses. And the first form of behavior that is formed in evolutionary biology is the immediate response to whatever environmental cues you're getting, like the reaction to move your hand away from fire. This is biological instinct. In physiology, we call these responses feedback loops. To just fortify the foundation of living organisms relevant to the whole universe, he describes life as completely relative to 1, the environment, and 2, changes in the environment and therefore time. As individuals, we're just these pools and machines that take in energy, develop it somehow, and then release it again. And everything that we do, and the characteristics of our experience of life, are all based around the context of our environment and what we need to live in the place that we are for the amount of time that we're meant to be. I'm going to repeat that last part again. Everything that we do and the characteristics of our experience of life are all based around the context of our environment and what we need to live in the place that we are for the amount of time that we're meant to be. So what are your thoughts on this, Oliver?
I think what I really love about Handwerker's whole emphasis on genetic inheritance and that whole model of looking at the human species as a whole is just, if you think of science, you think of, data, knowledge, the accumulation of that. Through this perspective, that is not the exclusive right of science. Science cannot say it is the sole holder or purveyor of knowledge, data, perception, anything like that. It's saying there are multiple mechanisms of memory, knowledge being stored, and for that to be incorporated in our lives. And saying that there's a genetic basis to that. I mean, I think that's the beauty of it, of saying, even the scientific method, starting with observation, saying it's all about 5 senses, that's all we have. This is the common language of both, genetic memory and science. I think is a really, really cool way to go about it.
Yeah. And so, as I previously talked about, our biological instinct is purely that intake of the environment by senses and then the immediate effect of an action. It's the simplest form of reaction. So, to go back to Handwerker, author of The Origins of Evolution and Culture, he launches his development of consciousness as a more developed reaction to environmental changes in time. And this is where it gets really interesting to me. One thing that this made me think about a lot is environmental changes in this context inherently equal time. And I know that it sounds obvious, but I just want to break that down for a moment because change requires time. And I often reflect on the role of time in our lives, in our development, in our maturation, our understanding of the world. And for me, like my general worldview is that time equaling development for an individual is in general not true. I find that to be kind of an illusion. But this sort of I had that mental play moment where I replaced time in that context with environmental change. It's like, could it be not time in itself, but environmental change that usually requires time that actually provides our mental development, our understanding of the world? Like, usually people think that the longer that you've lived, the wiser and more understanding you are, but at this age, I know that that's not true. I'm sure that you know that that's not true. So obviously there's another factor at play in our development that isn't just time. And to me, it's really interesting to replace that concept with change, because even like the smallest chemical reaction requires time. seasons require time. Nature requires time. And in that way, it's almost like, I know once again that this sounds obvious to say, but it was so interesting for me to like deconstruct in my head. But time is almost the unit of the natural world because the world is ever changing, and every interaction, every exchange, even energetic exchanges that are seemingly instantaneous require like this value of time. And in that way, it's related to learning.
I think that feeds into just looking at evolution as a model of change over time. What has made it so productive is you do take, generation by generation over millions of years. You're just asking what can happen to any given life form if it's refined under these conditions over an insanely huge time frame. Like that's a testament of time more than anything. Like there's truly only so much that can happen.
So the launching point from this about the paper, and to me this was super interesting, and I kind of have a weird tangent that I want to go off based on this. But what Handwerker is getting at in his paper is that for animals and species that have short time spans, shorter than the duration of the environmental changes that they will go through in their lives, these animals can function with that biological instinct, that immediate reaction alone. I'll give you an example. An adult mayfly that lives one day does not experience a disruption in the extinctual pattern of the environment and can therefore survive that one day, its lifespan, just fine because its body is made to do so. It doesn't require anything other than the biological instinct. But if an adult mayfly experiences a meteor strike the one day that it's alive, it would not be able to survive this environmental change with biological instinct alone. Because in general, in terms of evolutionary biology, there would be no reason, there's not enough environmental change during its lifespan to have any other developed form of learning or responses other than that biological instinct. And so, to give an alternative example, animals that have a longer lifespan are more likely to experience environmental change during their lives. And so, how does biology evolve to this? This favors the production of memories, which are just stored perceptions and experiences, like that sensory information that we're talking about. Now it's stored because you're going to have to pull back to that information that you're storing based on your past experiences to make a decision about the future whenever this change occurs. This allows us more options in how we modify our behavior with environmental changes. Thus, selection will favor individuals that have capacity to have memories in a species with a longer lifespan or in an environment that has a lot of change. So this kind of made me have a big thought that I wanted to play with, because obviously the main theme of this is that level of consciousness or more developed consciousness is required for longer lifespans or for very, what's the word that I'm looking for? Volatile environments that experience a lot of change. So, one thing that I thought about, like a wonderful representation of this instinctual knowledge that humans have of this, what we just talked about, because that's why I love culture. It's just like symbols that store this knowledge. You know that I'm a huge vampire buff, right? I'm not
I had
talking
no
like,
clue.
I'm not talking Twilight or Vampire Diaries. I mean, I'm talking New Orleans vampires, historical vampires. And I find it so interesting that so many cultures that are separated have this lore and this myth and this motif of this eternal being that also feeds off of other humans' blood. I mean, that's another weird part. But just for example, if more developed consciousness is required for a longer lifespan, then what could possibly be required for a being that has an infinite lifespan? It would require a consciousness that's way above ours. And it just reminded me of that motif of a vampire. And it's almost like it's a interesting symbol that stores this information of sort of this being that has powers that are supernatural powers are above what we can comprehend as humans. And it's almost like that happens because they have such a long lifespan that requires a higher form of thinking and learning.
So, like, vampires are recreated culturally over and over again to kind of fill in each culture's need to have that exploration of what would immortality mean for us, basically.
So if we need higher forms of learning, higher forms of processing, I mean, this talked about specifically memories, but it's more than just memories. It's the ability to make cross connections of experiences that you've had in the world. And so what would our minds look like if our lifespan wasn't 80 or 100 years? What if it was like 400 years?
Mm. Just like, yeah, like how much just shit accumulates over the course of centuries where you're just trying to make more and more sense of everything that you've seen now. Is like, do you have any choice but to become a monster in response to that?
Anyway, I'm
I
gonna
want to see if
pass
we,
the floor to you.
yeah, I want to see if we, I don't know, it'd be fun if we could do something with that, but that was still, I'm still pretty happy with that.
Yeah.
No, I mean, what I love is just going back to like the whole instinct part of it. I started reading this paper, and the way I started seeing it that I really, really loved was seeing culture as filling this kind of like species niche that evolutionary instinct, that model of inheritance cannot fulfill. Again, because, looking at instincts having a biological, genetic, evolutionary basis, that only gets selected and refined over millions and millions of years. So, given enough time, maybe evolution will take care of everything. But what are we supposed to do until then? Like, that's the concept I always like reminding myself and reminding other people. Every species is a work in progress. There's no such thing as a completed species that is perfectly adapted to the environment. There's an ice age every like 20,000 years. So no matter what a species is doing, even if it, cracked the code, every 20,000 years, it's like, never mind, ice age, start growing fur, you know? So the environment changes quicker than species do. So we're always in this loop of just trying to catch up to that. So to me, the question is just, how are we supposed to make sense of or just respond to the world in that little gap that evolution can't cover? And that's where I see, especially with like how handworkers exploring it, that's the gap that culture covers. What you were saying, within our lifetime, our attempt at sense making, trying to figure out what's good for us, what's bad for us, while we're here in this little cycle.
Yeah. And I don't know if you picked up on this, but another claim that he makes, which I think is huge, like I would not have thought about it this way, but he essentially claims that culture is an individual thing. Did you catch that?
Oh, everyone just kind of like has their own idea of what's supposed to go on, like how to respond to stuff. That's just
Yeah.
inherited or spread.
There's no shared culture. Individuals have their own culture, and sometimes it overlaps because of the senses. Like people who were in similar environments are going to be experiencing similar things, but essentially he's saying that culture is an individual event. And that's really interesting to think about. Another thing that I didn't know how to bring up in the context of this conversation, because I find it to be a little confusing to wrap my head around, but it's a really interesting thing. Whenever it comes to evolutionary selection of this more developed consciousness, this higher level of thinking, the ability to create memories, make decisions based on changes in the environment, Handworker actually claims that having the optimal ability to make these perfect decisions is negative. Like
Mm.
he actually argues that
Yeah, the
the
paradox.
the individuals that make mistakes and that have gaps in what they believe to be true versus what actually happens, those are the ones that selection will favor.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I love a good paradox, like every paradox is just a nice little gateway into the complexity of being here. So, I mean, like, I'm already kind of on board with that. I mean, I think it stacks up pretty well. Like, the way Handworker tries to explore that, very wordy and conceptual and didn't quite make sense to me at first. But once I tried to digest it, it's like, what's obvious of just basically arguing that, again, if there is this niche for sense making within the span of a lifetime, anything that you try to fix into a species with genetics, instinct as a model of inheritance, by the time, that's fixing the population, the whole world has changed. We're going to have this next generation that's like genetically prepared, expecting a whole different world. But that's not what's waiting for them. So that's kind of how I interpreted that, of like, we do not want evolution, or a species is not set up for success if evolution is responding that quickly. But we still have that need for, shorter, more responsive, like, interaction with our environment. Evolution wants to make us conducive to those responses, but doesn't want to have anything to do with what the answer is.
Yeah. I think another, and I am looking for the exact quote of this because I think it would be interesting. But one thing that he talks about, and sort of this is where I went with this idea of, it's actually not optimal to be perfect in your process of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
To me, it was almost like the gap between the best outcome technically for whatever task you're trying to do. Like say that we're talking about the rise of agriculture and we're talking about some ancient primate's ability to propagate and domesticate plants. I think what he's almost saying is because nature requires this constant, very large sum of interactions, not just between the human and whatever they're trying to domesticate, because this is, I'm thinking about this in terms of human evolution, so that's why it's very, like, human-centric. But it's almost like the mistakes that are made and that gaps of knowledge leave room for other species to then adapt to us. Right? It's not like we have the complete force and power and control over everything. Like, take the apple, for example. Take any consumable plant, literally. They adapt to us. They want us to eat them so that we could spread seeds, so that we could help them propagate. And so they actually adapt to manipulate us. But if we were perfect in every way, then we would catch that before they could influence us. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to say?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, what you're saying reminds me immediately of,
That book?
let's see,
Because
yeah, the
that's,
book Botany of Desire.
yeah, okay,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Botany of Desire, I actually read that book.
Hold on. Botany of Desire by Michael Pollan.
Yes,
Yeah.
we love him. All of his books are great. But I actually read that book in high school. I didn't like any of the science classes that were offered. And so the headmaster of my school had a PhD in botany, has a PhD in botany. And I asked him if we could do an independent study on botany. And we read that book and then we had a book club moment. It was really cool. So that's definitely, like, that's part of, but it's true. Like, plants adapt to their consumers. Same thing for plants that are pollinated. Like, they adapt to look like the insects that pollinate them. And so I think that making mistakes in the process of learning and not having complete control over your environment because of that is beneficial because then it allows for your environment to grow around you. Right? Like, we wouldn't have these ecological, complex, interconnected interactions between all the species in an environment if humans had complete control over that environment.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe while you were talking, I kind of came across the thought of, you were saying sort of the weight that would fall on someone, an individual or a species, if we did make all of the perfect decisions and it wasn't optimal to make mistakes. Because essentially what handwork is saying is it's optimal to have imagination.
Mm-hmm.
That's what is selected for. But imagination doesn't always work. But having this bigger way of thinking is what's optimal, not necessarily having it be accurate all the time. And you were saying the weight of being accurate all the time would almost drive us insane. And so maybe it is interesting that vampires are always seen as monsters and that these eternal mythical beings are always seen as monsters because the weight of that, knowing of having a better ability to control the environment, but then whenever you have complete control over the environment, the environment around you pretty much starts to die. Do you agree that that's like the one only outcome that could happen?
Yeah. Well, I think it just goes down to the myth of perfection of just there's never going to be a perfect iteration. Because again, if you think of perfection as just being the ideal, no flaws, exact response to whatever's happening, like whatever's happening changes as soon as it happened. So you'll never have the perfect response to it because the conditions are never going to be that consistent. So even if you feel like you are just kind of like, all right, I finally figured out, like what my life is, what I'm supposed to do, how to make sense of, whatever's happening culturally, socially in the state of the world, next week the whole world has changed. So just kind of like, even if that was the perfect answer then, like a few days later, it's no longer worth anything. And maybe you just like threaded the needle for a few days. That probably felt pretty good, but that's not like real perfection. So it only exists if you just remove the existence of time. Was that in any way coherent? Like, was that anything?
Yeah. No, that definitely was. Yeah. He also talks about how culture is that higher level of thinking. It's the more developed cognitive ability to store our information and our experiences into different compartments in our brain. And that's true. Like that is what culture is. That's why for me, that's kind of what I was trying to say about medical anthropology. That's why I find medical anthropology to be so fascinating. Because I also have a medical, like true medical, cellular, molecular, physiological background in medical science. But even things that don't quote unquote work as medical treatments or therapies and whatnot that are more cultural remedies to something, they usually, even though they don't directly translate to medicine, it represents some sort of stored information. And that's what's so interesting to me. I do wish that that was brought into the world of science a little bit more.
Which is
Yeah.
acknowledging, even if it wasn't the right answer for this instance, there's still some amount of truth in it, right? There is something real that it's speaking to.
Yeah. I mean, culture is technology in itself. It's the ability to store this information. So even if the act of what a cultural ritual is doing doesn't seem logical from a scientific perspective, can we reconsider it in terms of holding a piece of knowledge that we can get to and consider? I mean, I want to have a whole other episode based on science and the history of science as we can see it from alchemy, from magic, from um I mean, I'm from Louisiana. I live and breathe and bleed Louisiana. So from my perspective, my background and research is like on voodoo and Native American cultures and Cajun cultures. Even looking at these things of what truth can we extract from that, even if it's not the directly translatable kind. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there are two things that I just want to touch on before we move on too much more of just evolution and mistakes. That is one of the core tenets of evolutionary theory. All evolution is just picking out over time whatever mistakes happen to work pretty well. There is no, divine God hand when a bird's evolving that's inspiring this bird to say, oh, wait, if I get super colorful, all these ladies are going to love me. I'm going to like pump my plumage up with pigmentation. There's no bird saying that. There's just, every bird is just a little mistake that had like some variation in coloration for literally no reason. And then some female birds, for whatever reason, said, hey, I like that bird that's slightly bluer than that other bird. And then that just pattern's repeated. And then you figure out later on that, like, oh, blue pigmentation is kind of correlated to nutritional value, the fitness of an animal. It's like, producing bright colored pigmentation, it requires a lot of energy and nutrition. So the only birds that can produce higher blue pigmentation are the ones that are better at foraging, better at living, yada, yada, yada. So the idea is just individuals are making whatever mistakes or weird expressions of their lives are happening. And then just over the course of time, the ones that just aren't helping even a little bit are just kind of phased out. And the stuff that actually is doing a pretty good job kind of gets stuck in the population and it's just part of the species now. So evolution is millions of mistakes stacked on top of each other until you have like a working species that's able to respond to the environment better than the ancestors could. But yeah, if you had a perfect species, or like if you had this perfectly adapted animal that said it can extract whatever nutrients or energy it needs from its environment perfectly, the population is stable, there's the perfect number of adults needed at all times to just like maintain that population curve. The second the world changes, or the second another ice age comes, that whole population or that whole species is just going to be thrown off again. So there's no incentive to stay in this idealized single state that made sense for a given period of time.
Yeah. And I did find the quote that directly relates to what you just talked about. Can I share it?
No. No, go for it.
All right. Here is the quote from Handworker. This conclusion, and here he's referring to the paradox that we're talking about. This conclusion explains humanity's most fundamental dilemma and underlines what may be our greatest irony, that intelligence and the tendency to misconstrue reality are two dimensions of the same phenomenon. Human brains operate in a way that generate an extraordinary range of ideas and potential behavior, but these are wrong-headed in one sense or another. Many ways to think about and act in the world are not very useful, and some constitute fundamental mistakes. It follows that we must engage in an unceasing, interactive relationship with environmental parameters that creates the most distinctive characteristic of human life, its tendency to regularly change in new and unexpected ways.
That's such a pretty little conclusion, just opens up the whole world for you.
I know, and that's like I keep talking about how literature like this truly is beautiful. Like that was really the best way that he could describe that statement that he was just saying.
I do like how Handworker framed culture as this individual ideation kind of thing of just like everybody's coming up their own culture or their own idea of how should I respond to the world over the course of my life. Because I think it kind of creates or presents the need for science. Because if you think about it that way, it's all right, every Yahoo in the world is going around with their own cultural idea of how to live, basically, like everyone's own personal philosophy of like how best to live in this world. Under that way, or like under that way of seeing the world truly is like free market economy, where just everyone's just being thrown out into the world. There's going to be a whole bunch of idiots who go bankrupt trying, make it big. But then there's one dude who just kind of like sheer luck of the draw was like, I think there's gold in that river, make it big. And whether that be the actual extraction of resources or like, coming up with some idea of how to make industry more efficient, patent that, and then make the whole world better. That's a whole new mechanism of, culture as a way of refining the society or the species over the course of that generation.
I see what you're saying. That's really interesting.
So in that
It's
way,
really turning in like that individual culture into behavior. And I mean, okay, selection of behavior, social Darwinism, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the selection of successful project or business.
No, but I think that's where social Darwinism comes from. Like, if you do take this idea of just if culture truly is this individualistic, people who just happen to get it right succeed, everyone else just gets screwed over or just kind of adapts it or dies. In that way, it mimics, again, evolution, just kind of the genetic basis of some mistakes make sense, some mistakes don't. But even then, that happens over the course of, huge amount of time of that being refined.
So social Darwinism, just for people who don't know, like a 30-second overview, that's this idea, and I think it's been debunked. Like it's not the general consensus that social Darwinism is a correct way of thinking. But essentially it's saying that selection will favor your actions, And the reason why that can go down a bad rabbit hole of thinking is people use it as the sort of explanation of, oh, well, this person did this, then yeah, they deserve to be really bad off, or like they deserve to essentially die, or like I don't know. It gets really sticky in terms of trying to rationalize your own biases by using this term social Darwinism or something. But I think the difference is social Darwinism talks about the outcome of individuals based on the individual's actions. But I think one thing that's interesting that you're saying is you're almost looking at like community as an individual, but then there are a bunch of people within that community that are doing things that are going to be selected for. And so at the end of the day, the community is going to benefit from this. The community is going to select whatever development in technology, whatever business development, resource finding, all of these stuff. It's going to benefit the community at the end of the day. And it's not judging an individual based on an individual's actions. It's judging a community based on 100 individuals in that community. And yes, it makes sense that that would lean towards beneficial selection. Does that make sense what I just said?
No, I get what you're saying, because like there is this idea that like, all right, if we do let, the world go hog wild, let people figure it out, eventually, we'll land at something that's better than what we had before. I think the best way to frame that is that truly the best way to do it? Kind of like in the same way that we don't just want to leave the entirety of our fate to evolution over time, and how culture was kind of response to that. Do we just want to be a cultural free market, let everybody follow their own little personal philosophies, let those who are killed from it die, and let everybody else who happens to get it right succeed? I think the question is there an even better way to do this? Can we take these ideas of individual cultural concepts of what's going on, how to do things, and hold that up to scrutiny? And to me, that's what science is. Or that's my understanding of what science became, is another step back from culture, where we all have these models we've generated interacting directly with the environment that, have been made, inherited from whatever way, just by being here. Can we apply another lens of remove, like make a model of the model to assess which ones are good, which ones are bad, in like a controlled, smaller scale setting, so that we don't have to truly just send everyone off into the meat grinder to know for sure?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Like sort of that structured learning that we're talking about. It's almost like without going through all of the pain of failing, we're still learning. We're still having outcomes that increase our knowledge about our environment.
I'm thinking about like every now and then I see a paper that comes up where scientists created a model of a human evolved to maximize survival against car crashes. And he has like no neck. He has like a nipple on every rib. He's just like a
What
brick.
was the point of the
He's
nipple?
just like
really?
I think the idea is just memory tissue's like softer, more cushioning. So just that is, like again, evolution works through modification of what we already have. If, the human body over a million years is trying to figure out how to cushion each rib against a car crash, it's just going to put a nipple there, or like or like little breast tissue there. So, you just come up with this freakish brick of a man who I guess isn't going to die from the whiplash. But I think that's and like, everybody was having, just like tearing it apart because, just like, dear God, we don't want humanity to go in that direction. But I think that's a perfect example of this. If this was something that would happen over millions of years, if we were consistently getting car crashes, huge amount of mortality in the human cycle, of course we'd evolve against that. But ideally, we wouldn't be dealing with shit like that through evolutionary models of response and inheritance of ideas and ways of being. We just come up with ideas of how to avoid that. Hopefully just be in less car crashes. But no, I think that's just a very clear case where society was just kind of like, oh yeah, obviously this isn't something evolution should deal with. This is something that falls into like a different category. I think that's just what Handworker was really fleshing out for me, of looking at response over different chunks of time. Different models of inheritance make sense. Super, super long-term, like species scale, it's going to be evolution as a model of inheritance and response. Multi-generational or, fewer generational, or even within a generation maybe, there's going to be more of a cultural response. But if we want to do something or respond to something very exact, very precise, as it's been presented to us, even within a generation, or try and understand things within that time, a scientific approach is what makes the most sense.
Yeah.
And so that's what I see as the niche that science fills. Even outside the question of what science even is, this is why it exists.
Yeah. But I do want to sort of really open the box of science and the scientific method as well. Because there are a lot of considerations whenever we're talking about seeking truth from the scientific method, and I want to talk about that. But sort of what brings that to my brain is I'm going to repeat this one line from that quote that I read from Handworker. But it says that it follows that we must engage in an unceasing interactive relationship with the environmental parameters that creates the most distinctive characteristic of human life, its tendency to regularly change in new and unexpected ways. End quote. To me, what that is saying is if we're wanting to seek truth of life, because life is so complex and interacts with so many different levels and facets, then we're going to need to view it in the chaotic lens of the whole environment, ourselves in the environment too. And so I think one interesting thing that that brings up is inherently the scientific method requires control variables. We change one variable and then we observe what happens to our subject whenever that variable is changed. So logically, it seems like that should make sense, right? Because now we're observing exactly what the behavior of our subject is going to be because we're comparing it to all of these different environments based on our variable that we're changing. But then we have to acknowledge that because we're creating this highly controlled environment, is it really possible to extract natural truth from that? Say that we observe our subject behaving one way in a laboratory, in a highly controlled environment. What's to say that that's how it's actually going to behave in nature whenever there's now thousands of other variables that are all tangled and interconnected and influencing it? How do we really know? In that way, the scientific method is almost, it's a form of domestication of our environment. And I feel like it's worth bringing up that there's a potential that we can only learn how this thing reacts in a domesticated way, but we can't claim to know how it acts in the wild, right? Like, just to give an example, if you're trying to study the behavior in canines and you study the behavior of a domesticated dog and then claim that that's how wolves act in the wild, that wouldn't make sense, right? And so the same can be said with cells, if you think about it. In a laboratory, if we're studying a cell in this highly controlled environment, what I did today in the lab, the whole thing that I was going through was keeping this highly sterile environment to study the cell. But then, is that ever what it is in nature ever? No. So how can we claim to understand the natural way that something is going to act whenever we're studying it in an inherently unnatural way?
What I think about there is you've put in one end of the spectrum of you can create this incredibly controlled, truly isolated environment where you can say or pretend that you've drawn some amount of information that applies to the world from it. Like the image that always comes to my mind is just thinking about particle physics or really abstract theoretical chemistry where if you put, this atom in this perfect temperature controlled vacuum chamber and study how it responds to different, like radiation signals, frequencies, whatever you're doing to it, you can maybe say you understand something about it. But even in those trials, the language of control comes from this intellectual desire or belief that control is possible, but isn't a real thing. Even if you think about the control variable of saying, we did this study at room temperature, like room temperature being a temperature control. That's just 70 degrees. Like we just choose that because it's what we keep most rooms at. It's what feels comfortable to us. It feels controlled or kind of like stable to us. That exists just as one data point along the whole temperature spectrum, So like that's just another variable that we're keeping consistent. Even what we're calling control here is just one potential state that could alter whatever assumptions that we're making. But even that was a little bit of tangent. Even if we do have proper experimentation, how applicable is this to the wild? I bring this to my own experience of just doing ecological research.
Yeah,
And
I was gonna ask you to sort of dissect the scientific method in ecology. Like,
yeah,
what would that even mean? Is it even the same?
no, I think about that constantly. Like the story that immediately came into my mind just in having this whole conversation was doing, savanna ecological research in South Africa when I was there doing my honors thesis, working with a PhD ecology researcher from University of Florida, Gainesville. And we were just having a little like workshop breakout session where we were just talking about how to do ecology research. And he just asked the question, how many of y'all, like of the whole group, in y'all's scientific career, have you done an experiment? And we're like, well, what the hell kind of question is that? For scientists, like, of course we do experiments. He's like, no, tell me about it. When in any of your research have you done an actual experimental condition where you set up an experiment, have controls, and you're deriving conclusions based off of that? And we're all just sitting there thinking about all the work we've done, what we've been publishing, writing up as part of our careers, and we're like, oh, we aren't doing experiments at all. Like, so much of what we do is just purely observational. We do introduce variables. If we want to study herbivory, we'll set up a fence in one plot to say, all right, this is what happens when there aren't herbivores eating the plants. And then we can compare that to what's going on over here to say, this is what happens when herbivores can eat the plants. Or if you're studying, the effects of fire, you can set fire over here and then not set fire over here. But you never really have a condition, a true proper control, because it's not like we can just make a whole ecologically perfect biodome every time a researcher wants to try something. It's just not viable. But even if it was, I think that's still missing the point of what we're doing. We still consider it science. This is still getting published, accepted by the community. But all we're really doing is sticking our fingers in the ecosystem, throwing something out there and seeing what happens, and then recording it religiously.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. It really, once again, it's always the concepts that seem simple that are really just mind-blowing. I actually had to sit down and think about ecology as a science is purely observational. I cannot say the same for the work that I do. It is not purely observational because we're not observing something in its natural setting. What you talked about in the intro episode, you said something really beautiful where you were talking about your interest in ecology because it was both intellectually stimulating, but it was grounding. Like you were doing all of these projects and then at the end of the day, you sit back and you realize that you're in a forest. You're part of this bigger living organism, this bigger ecosystem. That's very unique in the world of science. Ecology is extremely unique in the world of science. And maybe to reconcile my question about how we apply the scientific method and does it actually work and can we actually get data from it, I guess in a way, it's still very much observational work. It's just controlled observational work. I don't think the question is the data legitimate? Are the results legitimate? It's more of how do we apply it? Where do we apply what we learn? Because we can't study cells that are just in a cell culture, basically not a petri dish because that's for bacteria, but essentially in a plate and say that that's exactly what's going to happen in the human body. Like we just can't. And so I think that it does allow for observation. It's just highly curated observation. And I think that that is, it's worth thinking about. I mean, obviously any biomedical researcher would say, yeah, I completely agree. And that's why it's important to have models, like animal models, if you're trying to study stuff to impact humans. It's important to have an animal model that's very similar to human physiology so you can see it in real life. Not everything is just cell cultures. Like we do have animal models. But just saying, with an environment that controlled, it's kind of hard to apply it to nature. But I guess also we're in the Anthropocene. It isn't nature anymore. We aren't applying things to nature. We have domesticated ourselves. We haven't just domesticated everything around us. We've domesticated ourselves. And I think maybe it's not trying to, dissect the truth in the method. Maybe it's more of being aware of where we're applying the results, what context we're going to be projecting the results. But one question that I had for you, what would it look like to study cellular and molecular biology from an ecological perspective?
I'm guessing this is getting back into your question, is all science ecology? That perspective. I think so many scientific fields, or especially what referred to as the hard sciences, are just subsets of larger biology or ecology. Chemistry and physics, I think both of absolutely as just ecology unapplied, because you never have, you know, atoms, elements just sitting in a void, behaving with their electron shells, doing nothing. They're always interacting with something in some capacity, and that easily falls under ecology of both organic, inorganic, just everything happening in the world as we know it. So I think it
Ecology of
all.
forces, ecology of energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like,
Wow.
yeah.
I never considered that.
Whoa! We're breaking ground here. Yeah. Well, I think in so many cases, just like ecology and just complexity are pretty interchangeable of each other. There are times where just I feel like I see some article trying to, act like it's breaking the world by saying like the ecology of economics. You're just talking about complexity, like the idea of there being multiple things at once that don't all fall under one nice little box that you're tied for yourself. So I feel like you're saying like cell biology or molecular biology.
Yeah, like
What would those look like
can
under
you
an
give
ecological
me
lens?
can you give me a clear example, almost a hypothetical project where you would study cellular or molecular biology from an ecological perspective?
Mm. All right. I think to take an ecological lens would be saying the only way to get higher quality, more reflective data that would be truer to reality is to take away control. So just
So
like,
what would that look like? Like what would be an example of what a project would look like?
yeah, whenever I'm reading a paper, I think it's just whenever you see a variable that says we did this under field conditions, basically just saying we left this outside or we didn't really control for this. That's one of the things reading a paper that always just kind of pisses me off. I'm just like, well, now we can't really know what that means. It's uncontrolled. You can't derive any information from that. But on the other hand, that's probably a lot realer. Again, any living system is just going to be much more chaotic no matter what it is. So you might have better results just exposing it to something random and saying we don't even know what was going on than
Right,
saying it happened under these exact conditions.
that's almost the paradox of what I'm talking about. With every study, it's one or the other. It's either clear results or applicable results.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I want to tie in wilderness, right? And in the beginning, I was talking about the history of learning because learning, like we said, science is structured learning. And so if we're going to talk about science, we need to talk about, where learning came from and why we do it. It's so that we can exist in our environment better. And now we live in cities, we live in basically empires with technology. We have a very profound understanding about the world around us. But there was a time where it was not like that at all. Like we were animals, we were primates. And so at some point, all of these breakthroughs and understandings happened, and the only source that we had to learn from them was the environment. There was a time, not the Anthropocene, where all there was animals and environment, primate and environment. There was nothing else. There was no control. And so learning, our basic understanding of the biological world, what we almost feel to be true, not know to be true, but feel to be true. I can't use the word instinct because we already define that in a different way. But everything that we feel to be true about the world around us came directly from the environment. And I know I keep saying that, but that means literally watching the trees and the insects and the animals and the geology and the water systems, watching it all interact and trying to deduce some sort of fact from that. All of this stuff happened from our environment. And so now, my big question, and it's part of this big paradox, our environment looks completely different than what it did. Whenever we're talking about true nature, the only place where true nature exists is in the wild, wilderness. Right in my environmental arts and humanities capstone, we talked a lot about simply the economy of foraged food and wild meat, game meat, and things like that. there's a value that it has that's different than the normal. Literally, the soil nutrients make things taste different. It gives it a different quality that it did not have before. It gives it more robust nutrients because it produces more chemicals to interact with the animals that are interacting with it in the wild. Like, it's a different level of nature. And my big question, and it's sort of a concern, we all know that one major thing that has changed in our world over decades, centuries, years, shorter and longer time spans is the amount of wilderness that exists. Whenever we remove ourselves from wilderness, from biodiversity, because that's like the main element of wilderness that makes it, wild, true nature. It's biodiversity. And so removing ourselves from that, what is our classroom? How do we learn then? Like, we're still learning because we're intelligent beings, but what are we looking at? What are we picking up the patterns of? Because it's not nature anymore. What are your thoughts?
I think there are a lot of places where I would challenge you on that. Well, one saying, is it not nature anymore, or is it not wilderness anymore? I am of the philosophy that everything is natural, that in a certain way, saying there is a difference between natural versus unnatural is kind of like a way to remove ourselves from the current state that we're in. I think we're in less diverse, less rich ecosystems, but I don't think it's right to say we're no longer in one. And even just the whole perception of wilderness, just go to the question of what is wilderness. I think that's just any ecosystem that humans don't exist in. But, I even think about my work in South Africa, arguably one of the most intact ecosystems in the world, Kruger National Park, megafaunal savanna that's a few hours away from the cradle of humanity, where like humans evolved, and there are species there that know how to behave around humans because we've been here for, like millions of years. I don't think human existence is inherently antithetical to wilderness. I stand by, I don't feel need to challenge, like the classical view of wilderness of a full biodiverse ecosystem without humans in it. But to me, I think what wilderness is really about, that people are drawn to say why it's important, is just a lack of control. And I think if you look at the modern state of the world, I think it is a human myth that we have been able to remove themselves from it, because if you think about what questions people are asking themselves in their lives, it's, how do I keep food on the table? Just kind of like, how am I going to get my kids to school? How do I make a living? These are all, very late stage capitalistic or economic questions, but I think they're also survival questions. I think everybody is still trying to make it work in the world as it is. And I think the reason so many people do feel lost or challenged or just scared with the state of the world is because we haven't been able to avoid that. We've just kind of like changed where the wilderness is. I think that does feed back to what you're saying of what are we learning from, where's that information coming from. Again, it is much more human and much less reliant on other species. I think that is just what allows a new dimension of insanity. We are able to enter these echo chambers where it is just human ideas on top of ideas on top of ideas to the point where we're just driving each other insane. But I think that's something a lot of species do. I think about, there's this one, in my evolutionary biology class, the professor was an ornithologist. And an ornithologist is someone who studies birds. So this one South American bird, where the thing the males do to like attract women is that they have like these wings that they buzz in incredibly high frequency, kind of like a grasshopper or katydid, but they like overlap and create this weird localized air vibration that creates this audible vibratory sound. And based off like the quality or the intensity of the sound, the males are more likely to attract females. It's their reproductive, like how they attract women, how they have kids, that whole cycle. But the thing about it is that, so, in response to that, the more successful birds, instead of, other bird species just getting more colorful, their wing bones have gotten thicker and more robust to be able to handle vibrating at these high frequencies without, their wings getting destroyed. And it's directly hurting their ability to fly. Like, they're just getting worse and worse at flying, because the only reason birds can fly is because they have these incredibly light, hollow bones, and they're just built around it. But now that they have these super heavy wing bones, they're only able to do controlled bursts of flight, or these controlled glides, because they are stuck in this interspecies conversation about what they want to be. They're destroying themselves a little bit in the process. And when I saw that species case study, I'm like, oh, they're just like us. Like any species kind of starts collapsing on itself a little bit. But I think that's just part of the trade-offs.
You're right. They're just like us, having the same crises as we do. Just going back to Handwerker's quote, I'll read it one more time. It follows that we must engage in an unceasing, interactive relationship with environmental parameters that creates the most distinctive characteristic of human life, its tendency to regularly change in new and unexpected ways.
So it's unavoidable. And that's where I see where the wilderness is. Anytime there is continuous change that's outside of our control, deeply intact human altered ecosystems are one of the biggest examples of that in the cultural broader conversation that a lot of people recognize. I don't like referring to that too much because I feel like if you delve into too much, it gets pretty eco-fascist pretty quickly. About just saying, humans are inherently a problem in any ecosystem that you put them in, but it erases all the historical examples of humans developing beautiful, enriching relationships with their ecosystems. So I think it's dangerous to just say humans plus nature equals bad.
I just wanted to give you a chance to talk about your interest in urban ecology. What does that even mean to you? Why do you find that to be valuable?
Urban ecology?
Yeah.
Urban ecology as a whole, or just kind of like the non-rejection of urban human spaces, is how I really think about it. I think that is incredibly crucial, because I feel like it's one of those things that if you just kind of look at it with a biological, ecological lens, it falls apart pretty quickly. So, if you want to say about cities, they're all like urban jungles, it's all concrete, it's all gray. I mean, it's not like there's much more happening in a desert. Deserts are fully intact ecosystems. They can be incredibly diverse. A lot of that is just huge stretches of just mineral stone with little chunks of biodiversity here and there. I see cities as the same way. Again, it's less diverse because, you have people instead of a whole suite of different organisms, but that's still organisms within populations interacting with each other and in a geological landscape. So I think if you just broaden your understanding of what an ecosystem is, you can easily see it as one.
That's really beautiful. I really love that message of hope as well that it gives, because biodiversity is very important to me. I think that it's the most important thing that we have on this planet. And so it does worry me. Like, urbanization worries me. But I understand what you're saying, right? I guess biology always finds a way.
Yeah. And I think there's so many dimensions of, I think, again, this just goes back to Handwerker, of talking about how many different models of inheritance and knowledge and refinement there are. We have culture and science and evolution. All of these are models that generate different layers and types of knowledge. And if we want to say we prioritize knowledge, understanding, diversity, any of those things on the broadest level, we wouldn't just pin ourselves down to a single conversation. I want to live in a world where I don't have to choose between culture and intact ecosystems. I want to live in a world where the rainforest is beautiful, doing its thing, and we're able to go in there and see what's going on. And also want to see what's going on in contemporary music. Like I want to be able to go back and forth and learn and figure out everything I can from both of these conversations. But that's what I think about a lot of, just like how everything is just different interactions of different ideas, if you look at it on a broad enough level. And that's why I think, again, when you talk about wilderness, if you do bring it on that same level of all those conversations, you can find it anywhere, right? I think about it too as just, where's the new frontier? That can be academic, that could be very well understood from a colonial lens of, the land we haven't stuck our fingers in yet. But I think it also can be academically, what are the areas that nobody really understands yet? I think about ecology, where we know what's going on with the birds, we know what's going on with plants, we got mammals. But fungus, everyone's like, oh, we have no idea what the hell is going on there. There's the sense that there's this new academic frontier that nobody really understands. And then if you want to think about like cultural frontiers, I mean, I feel like that's so much political strife of what happens when two groups of people who've historically been separated for whatever reason start interacting with each other. That's a whole new frontier with a whole sense of wilderness, danger, uncertainty, and also possibility to it. And all these different conversations, sources of knowledge, sources of exchange, there's a frontier going on. And so I think as long as you see that and recognize it, there is so much potential for academic and scientific engagement. Because if you're saying, oh, human society is a waste, the only place to be able to have this conversation is in rainforest that no one's ever seen before. The second someone steps foot in it, that conversation's ruined anyway. But it's also just inaccessible. And I think I like urban ecology for the same reason, because I think for so many people, especially with the scarcity of access to natural spaces, the deterioration of wild ecosystems, but ones that we classically recognize, who gets to experience those and learn from those directly? Very, very few people, especially at this point with, how urban the world is becoming. But what happens if you can say those same people, the same principles that we preach about and talk about the beauty of in, the rainforest, you can see in this dandelion, in this crack in this pavement, in this parking lot behind your home? I think that's really what it's about.
Yeah, that was beautiful. No, that was really great. That was really good. It is really interesting to see your perspective, being a storyteller and a lover of people, but then also being an ecologist. It's a really, really interesting intersection that isn't explored that much.
Yeah, I think ecology makes that possible. Again, it's a very easy leap. Ecology is just the study of living systems. So you just take that mindset and you apply it to everything else you see. It's like, oh, everything is ecological.
Thank you so much for listening to our episode. For those of you who are interested in reading the books that we reference, the first one is The Botany of Desire, Plant's Eye View of the World, written by Michael Pollan. The second one that I talked about is called Feasting Wild, In Search of the Last Untamed Food. It was written by Gina Ray LaCerva in 2020. If you would like to contact us to give us ideas for different episodes, or if you would just like to say hi, please find us at our website, octorum.com. You can also find links to our Instagram and Facebook page as well. Thank you so much.